The genre of apocalyptic literature arose before and during the time of Israel's exile. And you see images that are important in those Persian and Babylonian contexts showing up in the imagery of Old Testament apocalyptic, and they get carried into New Testament apocalyptic. This explains a lot of the images in Revelation, and it explains the sheer number, the sheer size of the imagery. This is one reason I like to use music to help communicate how Revelation works. It's not really a discursive literature, it's a visual literature. And I think this is a reason why artists seem to do better at interpreting Revelation and knowing what to do with it, because it's on their wavelength. So much good historical work has been done to explain these metaphors and the way they operate. Your introductions, your New Testament surveys, study notes, one-volume commentaries like Kester's that I've already appealed to, they all provide invaluable background into understanding the metaphors and the role that the metaphors are playing. I'm not going to try to reproduce all that now. What I'd like to emphasize is something that actually gets a little less attention, and that's how the coming of Jesus Christ has made apocalyptic literature new. Old Testament apocalyptic prophets used the genre to foretell the pattern of God's deliverance of Israel. New Testament apocalyptic tells God's good news of Jesus Christ, retaining that inherited Jewish apocalyptic framework, but as we've seen, transforming it now that the Messiah has come. The imagery, which is so fundamental, can be literal or figural or allegorical. Here's literal imagery from the scene in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus enters triumphantly into Jerusalem in the last week of his life. He intentionally uses a donkey to communicate a message from out of the Old Testament prophet Zechariah chapter 9 on the right side of my screen. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So what did Jesus do when it was time to enter Jerusalem? He reproduced the scene with the image of a donkey. Chapter 21, Jesus sent 2 disciples into town, told them to get a donkey and a colt. Matthew tips off readers in verse 4. He tells us, this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, and now he quotes Zechariah 9, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. So the disciples did what Jesus said, and they rode into town, Jesus seated on the donkey, and the crowds got the imagery. And they said, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is a royal acclamation because Jesus has used a symbol of royalty. Now the donkey doesn't stand for something else. The donkey is just a donkey. But the donkey helps clue in the audience as to what's going on. The king is entering Jerusalem. That's literal imagery. But imagery can also be figural. One thing can stand for something else. In Mark 13, during that apocalyptic discourse that Jesus was delivering, Jesus uses a symbol meant to be taken figurally. Mark 13:14, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be. And then Mark adds this, let the reader understand. Mark wants his audiences to know this is a figure. You need to think about what he really means here. And what does that figure point to? Points to Daniel chapter 11, over on the right side of the screen. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. We're not going to go into Daniel chapter 11's context. Just know that Jesus wants the crowd to get what he's referring to. Daniel 11. They can read between the lines. And Mark wants to make sure that his Gospels readers know to read in between the lines. So this is figural imagery. Finally, images can be allegorical. They can refer to something else and not be so specific about what that something else is. On Jesus' last night with his disciples in the Gospel of John, Jesus uses an allegorical image. He says, if anyone doesn't abide in me, he or she is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. Well, if we are the branches, then what's the fire? Well, if we are the branches, then the fire represents our destruction. But our destruction isn't literal fire, since we're not literal branches. The whole image is meant to refer to something else. It's an allegory. Here's a list of a few symbols that Revelation is sampling in its mashup, Old Testament images that are carried into the New Testament. I'll just mention a couple. In the third row here, the fourth beast rises and falls. That's an image from Daniel chapter 7. What do those beasts represent? Empires: Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And then in chapter 8 come a ram, which is attacked by a goat. The ram is the Medo-Persian Empire falling to Greek kings. What does John's mashup do with that? Well, in Revelation, we read at length about a beast who rises out of the sea the same way that the four beasts rose out of the sea in Daniel. It's a mashup. It's a sample. And behind that beast is the great dragon that's behind all the beasts. In the book of Daniel, a little horn causes a lot of destruction. And in Revelation, there's a false prophet doing the kind of damage that the little horn did in Daniel. That false prophet might be the Emperor Nero. In the next row, images of Israel persecuted, the abomination of desolation, which we just looked at in Daniel 10 and 11, and again in chapter 12. In Revelation, we've already seen language of the Great Tribulation, out of which the faithful servants come. Next, Daniel chapter 12 ends with an image of God bringing the dead to life, the faithful dead and the unfaithful dead, to judgment. And of course, Revelation mashes up that scene in the great white throne judgment of the dead. Look at the bottom row of this chart. In summary, if you add up those images in Old Testament apocalyptic, they tell the story. God will deliver Israel from its present and future trials. And if you add up the symbols in New Testament apocalyptic, they tell the same story, but with our familiar twist. Jesus Christ will deliver his congregations, his churches, from their present and future trials. The message is the same, but Jesus has focused the message of Old Testament apocalyptic on himself, transformed it, given it new life and a new legacy.